Interestingly, Bryan Johnson has shared his rapamycin blood levels, and I get the impression he's probably competitive. So there you go. I've thrown down the gauntlet. One of the other interesting things that we did was an actual experiment to measure rapamycin in blood. At some point during this cycle, I would do repeated blood draws to measure the amount of rapamycin in my blood. And so the results were pretty interesting. No way to know for sure that this was caused by the rapamycin, but I'd say it's suspicious, at least. At the minimum, it's suspicious given the timing. My name is Matt Caberline, and welcome to the OptiSpan YouTube channel. Hey everyone, welcome to the OptiSpan podcast. On this episode of the R Files, I'm going to talk about some of the insights that I've gained from my most recent course of off-label use of rapamycin. So just to kind of set the stage, today is May 1st, and I started this course of rapamycin at the very beginning of 2024, so the first week of January. And when I started this course of rapamycin, my intention was to take 8 milligrams once a week for 12 weeks and then stop. And if you've been following the podcast and some of the R Files episodes, you will recognize that this has been sort of a pattern that I've adopted of cycling rapamycin, usually in 10 to 12 week cycles. So I started on January 7th and intended to take 8 milligrams once a week, ending March 24th. I actually have decided to continue this cycle, and so I'm still taking 8 milligrams once a week and will at least through the next month or two, and I'll describe my rationale for that as I go through this episode. So there are a few big picture ideas that I'll expand on today. So I would say first, I think this course of rapamycin has been similar as to prior courses, at least from my perception that, when I'm not taking rapamycin, gradually there's an increase in, aches and pains in my joints as I do resistance training in particular. That in the past I have perceived has been attenuated when I started taking rapamycin, and that has been my experience again this cycle. No obvious change in exercise endurance or performance or any of that. It's more just a perception of the sort of joint pain that I've experienced. I have had a perceived experience that it is easier to lose body fat when I've been trying to modify my diet, and I'll talk more about that. And DEXA, in fact, backs up the idea, at least, that I've been able to lose body fat without sacrificing lean mass. I know there's a lot of interest in the effects of rapamycin potentially on lean mass. Another thing that I learned was that my half-life for clearing rapamycin from the blood appears to be substantially shorter than what's reported in the literature. And so that's kind of interesting, and I'll show you the data in a minute. And then finally, I experienced a bacterial infection during this cycle. And so for any of you who, again, have been following the podcast, you may have seen the episode where I had an allergic reaction to an antibiotic that I was taking. That was because I experienced a bacterial infection on this cycle of rapamycin. Again, no way to know for sure if it was caused by the rapamycin, if rapamycin played a permissive role or just was chance, but it certainly is an interesting anecdotal data point. So I'll expand on all of those as I go throughout the rest of this episode. So the first one, the aches and pains, that is really just my perception. I can't say for sure whether it's real. I can say every cycle that I've done of rapamycin, this has been my experience, that I tend to feel, particularly in my elbows and wrists, some chronic pain whenever I'm doing resistance training, lifting weights. That seems to subside every cycle with rapamycin, and then it takes a while for it to come back. Again, that has been my experience this cycle. It could be psychological, could be placebo effect. It's really hard to know, but it does seem to be a repeatable, subjective experience that I am having. So the weight loss, body fat change is pretty interesting to me. So, I've heard anecdotal stories. I've seen on the Rapamycin News website people saying that, if they try to lose weight, they find that it's easier to lose weight while taking rapamycin. It really wasn't my intention to lose weight on this cycle of rapamycin. It actually turns out that this was related to DEXA that I got at the end of February. So again, if you're not familiar with DEXA, I'd encourage you to check out, we've had 2 episodes now on body composition and DEXA on the podcast. I'd encourage you to check those out. DEXA is dual X-ray absorptometry. It's a method for measuring body composition, particularly body fat, lean mass, and bone mineral density. I've been getting DEXAs, for the last couple of years periodically. My first DEXA was in December of 2022. At that point, I was at 21.4% body fat. And for those of you who saw our most recent episode on DEXA, you will recall that I got a DEXA scan in February of this year that showed a little bit of an uptick in my body weight and percent body fat from about 8 months prior to that. So in May of 2023, I was at 14.3% body fat. And then in February, that had ticked up to about 15% body fat with a couple of pounds increase in body weight. So it's not a big deal, but I think definitely I had slacked off a bit on my diet. So I wasn't completely surprised, but it really was sort of an opportunity to use this as a motivational experience to improve my body composition going forward. So you may have heard on that episode that Nick kind of pushed me into committing to the goal of getting to single percent body fat. My goal is really just to touch single percentages, so 9.99 I'll be happy with, but it is a kind of a cool goal, something I really never thought I would achieve in my life. So it's something that that I'm striving for. I will say, is single digits body fat optimal for health? First of all, who knows, right? It's going to be very individual. That might actually be optimal for me for health. It's certainly not my intention that I have to get to single digits to optimize my health. It's more a goal that I've got just to prove to myself that I can do it, and not really my intention to stay there at this point. But in any case, that was the impetus for, really starting to focus a little bit more on particularly my diet quality beginning at the end of February. And that's really what I did. I really just made an effort to clean up my diet. Like I said, I had slipped a little bit of, cheat days here and there, and really just focused on cleaning up my diet quality rather than limiting my caloric intake per se. The reason I'm going through this is what's been interesting to me is subjectively how easy it's really been to do that, to keep my diet clean and lose weight. And again, I've heard anecdotal stories about how people have said that when on rapamycin, it's easier to lose weight and lose body fat slowly, but consistently. Again, very subjective. Hard to know if it's real, but that has definitely been my experience. And I will say, in the past, it has not been easy for me to, really focus on diet quality and losing weight. So it's been a little bit surprising to me how it seems to be easier this time. So take it for what it's worth, N of 1. But I did unexpectedly, or I guess I should say, I wasn't planning to get a DEXA until May or June. But last week, I actually got a DEXA because we had a documentary film crew on site. They wanted to get some footage of a DEXA scan. So I went ahead and got a DEXA last week and was pleased to see that my body weight is down about 5 pounds over the 8-ish weeks from the end of February to near the end of April. And that was essentially all body fat. So no change in lean mass. If anything, a very, very minor increase in lean mass. So again, does it have anything to do with rapamycin? I don't know. But it is, I think, one of these things that's worth noting as an N of 1. And I think at a minimum, it's fair to say that while taking rapamycin off label, it certainly was my experience that it seems easier to lose weight, and that weight was exclusively body fat and doesn't appear to be any lean mass loss, at least over that 8-week period. So again, interesting data point just to put in our back pocket. So then one of the other interesting things that we did was an actual experiment to measure rapamycin in blood on this cycle of rapamycin. And this was the plan. At some point during this cycle, I would do repeated blood draws, and we would use the LabCorp sirolimus assay to measure the amount of rapamycin in my blood. And so we decided to do this the first week of March. So I'd been taking rapamycin 8 milligrams per week from that point for about 2 months. Okay, so it's about 2 months into the cycle. And so if we look in the literature, the half-life of rapamycin in blood is typically reported to be around 63 hours. So that's in organ transplant patients. And what that means is, whatever the concentration of rapamycin in the blood is at, time X, the time it will take to get to half of that on average should be around 63 hours. So for example, if you measured 10 nanograms per mil in your blood and then you waited 63 hours and did another measurement, it should be 5 nanograms per mil. You wait another 63 hours, it should be 2.5 nanograms per mil, and so forth. So that's how you calculate the half-life. And that's the typical number that's given in the literature for rapamycin, or in this case, it would be referred to as sirolimus clearance from the blood. Again, sirolimus is exactly the same molecule as rapamycin, so you can think of them as interchangeable. They're exactly the same. Okay, so we measured sirolimus in my blood, or rapamycin in my blood, at baseline. Baseline in this case was 1 week, almost exactly to the hour, from my prior dose of 8 milligrams. Okay, so that's what we're calling time equals 0. And then we measured again at 2 hours, 4 hours, and 24 hours. And again, this was the 9th week of the cycle. So, whatever steady state I'm going to be at, you would expect that I would be there by this point. And so the results were pretty interesting. So at baseline, again, that's 7 days out from my previous dose, the rapamycin in my blood was undetectable. So it was below the detection limit for the assay, which in this case is 1 nanograms per mil. So we'll just call it 0. Possibly was not 0, but it couldn't be detected by the assay. At 2 hours, it was 20.4 nanograms per mil. Now, I don't know if 2 hours is exactly going to be the maximum point of rapamycin level in the blood. Typically, you'll see it somewhere between 90 minutes and 120 minutes. So 2 hours seemed like a good place to measure. So 20.4 at 2 hours. At 4 hours, it had dropped to 13.8 nanograms per mil. And then by 24 hours, it was down at 2.9 nanograms per mil. And we can extrapolate and suggest that if we took another measurement at 7 days out at the end of the week, it would again be below the detection limit, which we're just going to call 0. So if we look at the plot, it's going to look something like this. Again, starting below the detection limit, maxes out at 2 hours at above 20 nanograms per mil, and then by 4 hours is all the way down to 13-ish nanograms per mil, 24 hours down between 2 and 3 nanograms per mil, and then we will assume that it's all the way below the detection limit again by the end of the week. Okay, so this is just a one-off measurement. We did not do technical replicates of these measurements. We did not repeat this experiment yet. So again, lots of questions, I guess, around whether we would see exactly the same thing if we did it again. But this is pretty interesting as just a one-off experiment here. This is more or less, at least in terms of the shape of the curve, kind of what we would expect. What's kind of surprising here is if we use these numbers and estimate the half-life for me, it's far less than the 63 hours that are in the literature and actually comes somewhere around 8 hours. So very, very short half-life for me in this particular test. Now, again, I need to replicate this. We will replicate it and see if we get similar numbers. It's also quite possible that I am what's called a fast metabolizer. So rapamycin, like many drugs, is metabolized through the cytochrome P450 pathway. There are known variants in this pathway that can affect how quickly you metabolize rapamycin and other drugs. It's quite possible that I'm a fast metabolizer. This would certainly suggest that. So that's something also that I can look into. But nonetheless, it seems likely that I am clearing rapamycin much more rapidly than the 63 hours we might expect from the literature. Interestingly, Bryan Johnson, whom I'm sure many of you are familiar with, has shared his rapamycin blood levels. Not exactly the same experiment. He was taking 13 milligrams, I think once every 2 weeks. And in his case, at 90 minutes, he had 26.5 nanograms per mil, so more than what I saw at 2 hours. But again, almost 60% more rapamycin in the dose that he was taking than what I was taking. After 3 days, that was down to 3.6 nanograms per mil. 4 days, 2.5 nanograms per mil, and then at 13 days below the detection limit of the assay. So if we plot Bryan's data on top of mine, it looks something like this. Again, clearly his clearance in this particular, again, one-off experiment that he did was slower than mine, but still much faster than we would expect if it was a 63-hour half-life. So this would put the half-life for Bryan at just under 24 hours. Now, I get the impression, I don't know Bryan Johnson well personally, but I get the impression he's probably competitive. So there you go. I've thrown down the gauntlet for the Rapamycin half-life leaderboard here. So anyways, both of us, it looks like, are probably well under the expected 63-hour half-life. It does make me wonder if, this may be a general phenomenon for people, healthy people using Rapamycin off-label when you compare it to what has typically been measured in organ transplant patients who are taking higher doses, usually taking it daily instead of weekly, and taking other drugs, right? Usually taking other immunosuppressants, strong immunosuppressants. So context may be very different, but I think this is interesting, and it would be neat if we could develop a larger data set on rapamycin pharmacokinetics in healthy people using the drug off-label. Okay, so there you go. Two people's experiences, both well under the reported half-life in the literature. Obviously, both of these are N of ones. It's also worth noting we don't really know what either of our max values were. So again, maybe next time, it'd be nice if I had measured 90 minutes and 120 minutes. That's a lot of getting stuck for blood draw, but maybe next time I will do that just to kind of find out, where that puts me. Again, it's also possible we're both fast metabolizers due to variants in the cytochrome P450 pathway. So we'll repeat this at some point, and I will be sure to let you know the outcome of that experiment. Okay, then the last potentially interesting thing I want to talk about here was the bacterial infection. So this was really surprising to me, and it was surprising in part because I really have only had one bacterial infection in my adult life. That was bacterial pneumonia after a pretty severe bout with influenza. Really, that's the only time in my adult life that I've been really, really sick. And this was probably, 15 years ago. So I'm not prone to bacterial infections. Now, the context here is potentially important. So there were really two things that I think precipitated my bacterial infection. One was that I was putting on a continuous glucose monitor. I've done this periodically off and on for the last couple of years. For those of you who aren't familiar with continuous glucose monitors, we'll have several episodes on this coming up, but there's a small filament that gets inserted under the skin. So it does puncture the skin when you put it on. Now, for reasons I don't know, Abbott in the Libre 3 stopped including a sterile wipe in the kit with the device. And so in the past, I've always, used one of these sterile wipes and wiped off the area of the skin where you're going to apply the CGM to sterilize it before putting the device on. I didn't do that this time. I was lazy. I knew I should. Okay, my fault. I get it. I should have sterilized the area. I didn't do it. I got a little cavalier with the CGM, I guess. So that's one thing that precipitated the infection. The reason why I know that precipitated the infection is that was the site where the infection occurred. So I put the CGM on. Within a few days, it was really hurting and irritated and bothering me. I actually left it on a couple of days longer than I probably should have. I took it off. And then that area gradually, became an abscess that was hot to the touch. And so I was prescribed antibiotics, which I'll talk about in a minute for the infection. But the other thing that was happening right around the same time was our family dog was having a pretty serious skin infection. And he has recurrent skin infections, for the last several years. He's almost 14, so an older guy. And has these sort of, recurrent skin and ear infections periodically. This was a really bad case where we were in the midst of shampooing and applying ointments to him on a daily basis. And so I'm sure there was lots and lots of whatever the bacteria were that were driving the skin infection floating around. And so I suspect that I had some of those bacteria on my skin, on my hands. I don't know for sure. But the combination of Dobby's skin infection with, my lack of proper etiquette and hygiene, sterile technique with the CGM, I suspect is what caused me to get this infection. Certainly the rapamycin could have created also a permissive physiological state, given that I don't seem to be prone to infections. That's hard to know for sure. But I think that's what drove the infection. Okay, so I was prescribed clindamycin as the antibiotic for this infection. The reason for that was, if it was a staph infection, perhaps some concerns about MRSA. Clindamycin is a very potent antibiotic, and if you saw our episode on the podcast about my allergic reaction to the antibiotic, you will see that I am allergic to clindamycin, or at least it seems that way. Potentially some interesting interactions there with the rapamycin, which I talked about in that episode. But nonetheless, it certainly does raise the possibility that this infection was a side effect or adverse event associated with my off-label use of rapamycin. This is hard. Of course, people get infections all the time. No way to know for sure that this was caused by the rapamycin, but I'd say it's suspicious, at least at the minimum. It's suspicious given the timing. Hasn't changed my views about rapamycin. Again, if you've sort of followed the content, I repeatedly say we don't really know whether rapamycin increases risk of bacterial infections, but it seems plausible that it might. It's probably not a huge increased risk, but a twofold increased risk of bacterial infection combined with the other precipitating factors that I talked about may have been enough to push me over the edge. So worth paying attention to, worth recognizing, and I would say worth adding to my personal data set on rapamycin. Okay, so that's it. Those are the things that I feel like I have learned from this particular N of 1 rapamycin cycle. I'm sure we'll have some additional updates on DEXA down the road, and if anything else unexpected or potentially interesting happens during this cycle over the next month or two, I will be sure to let you all know. So I hope that you found that interesting, informative. I know many of you are interested in rapamycin, and so I'm happy to share my experiences in the hope that they are valuable. As always, if you have any questions or comments, please leave them below. If you're not yet a subscriber to the channel, I would encourage you to subscribe, and I hope to see you all next time on the OptiSpan podcast.